Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by. Welcome to our webinar, Ways to Improve Your Record Keeping, a New Year's Resolution You Can Keep, brought to you by HRdirect. Our speaker today is Robin Schooling, an HR strategist with 25 years of senior management experience. You'll notice we have a chat feature with this presentation. Feel free to submit your questions to Robin and she'll answer them throughout the presentation. Now let's hand it over to Robin.
Thanks, Stephanie, and happy Wednesday to everyone. Glad that you're here joining us today. As Stephanie said, my name is Robin Schooling, and I've worked in human resources for about 25 years in a variety of industries, in a variety of organizations, some large global organizations, but I've also worked for small family-owned businesses. So I've experienced a lot of these things that kind of cover the breadth of the human resources experience. And currently I work as a consultant, I speak, I serve on some advisory boards, and do quite a bit of writing as well. I'm sitting here in Louisiana, and believe it or not, it's cold for us. We're preparing for our version of the polar vortex, but that's quite all right because it's also Mardi Gras season. So we're good to go. And looking forward to talking about today's topic. We are going to spend some time today talking about record keeping in HR. And to start us off, I'd like to share this quote from Albert Einstein, who once asked, if a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, of what then is an empty desk a sign? Now, I certainly don't want to suggest that we have empty minds, but I'm sure that most of us have more on our desk than we'd like and would love to clear that clutter. And now at the beginning of 2015, with our New Year's resolution still fresh, it really is the perfect time to start cleaning up our records. So today, this afternoon, what we're going to talk about is ways to get organized and improve our record-keeping systems, all while staying compliant with our applicable labor laws. And we'll start with what you can and can't throw out, and how to dispose of sensitive information securely. Once you've figured out what to discard and have streamlined your various records, well, then it'll be time to talk about transitioning to digital and electronic methods and creating organizational systems, all while protecting employee privacy. So before we start, and to kind of get a sense of where our conversation is going to go today, I want to get an idea of how most of our audience maintains their records, so we can kind of focus on some of the best advice. So as everyone's kind of taking this survey, which will be really helpful, I think we all realize that in the future, our workplaces will become more and more, if not predominantly, paperless. We're not quite there yet, but as our survey things are coming in, it's really kind of bringing out the point that many businesses already are relying on some digital and electronic record keeping. So think about your business. Think about, as you're answering this question, how you handle vacation requests or scheduling, performance reviews, personnel files, timekeeping. Very interesting to see. And I think we're kind of getting some evenly split answers here. Why don't we show the results of our survey? Pretty interesting. While we've got a number of organizations doing a pretty even mix of electronic and paper record retention, the reality is, look at that. Almost half of our audience is still using mostly paper, and that's the reality. That's the reality that we live in. I've worked in various offices and worked in various HR departments for a long time, and we've been talking about the paperless society, it seems forever, and we still can't quite get there. And that's okay, because we're going to help you bring a little sanity to that record keeping and those piles of paper that you do keep. We're also going to talk about some ways to successfully start that transition to digital or to electronic. So let's get going. And before we talk actually about organizing our records, we need to discuss how to clean them out. And you know, the phrase, when in doubt, throw it out, may be popular, but most of us who work in HR departments, you know, quite frankly, do the exact opposite. We keep everything forever, or so it seems, you know, just in case. Now, unfortunately, this can lead to a record-keeping mess. But even if you're diligent about cleaning out your records, there are probably some papers, some forms, some notifications that you're holding on to that aren't necessary. So let's go through some of the statutes of limitations, so to speak, on our common employee forms. And as we dive into this, I do want to remind everyone that we will be sending everyone a copy of the slides. So there's some information on here. There's some numbers. There's some years. There's some things that you'll want to have handy. You will get a copy of the slides sent to you after this presentation within the next day or so. So let's take a look at hiring, right? Let's start off at the beginning. And hiring involves a lot of paperwork, and there are a lot of laws and acts that specify how long these forms must be kept. Resumes and job applications, even for those individuals that you don't hire, must be held for up to 2 years. So where do these things come from? Well, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, has regulations in place, and as you may recall, the EEOC has oversight of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And both of those apply to employers with 15 or more employees. Now, the stipulation for private employers under the EEOC is that you keep related records for 1 year from the date of making the record or the personnel action involved. And for terminated employees, you must keep the personnel records for 1 year from the date of termination. Now, this includes, but is not limited to, requests for reasonable accommodation, application forms submitted by applicants, and records dealing with hiring, selection, employment testing, post-offer drug tests, things of that nature, as well as the related documents to things such as reference checks, background checks, or credit checks. So that's the 1 year requirement. However, take note that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which applies to employers with 20 or more employees, indicates that for applicants over the age of 40, applications and resumes must be kept for 2 years. So therefore, it may be easier as you organize your records to just maintain your hiring-related files and records for 2 years for all applicants and employees. Now, it's also important to note that should an employee or an applicant in the hiring process bring a discrimination charge against your business, you must maintain those files until a resolution or a decision has been reached, even if it has been over 2 years. When we look at other related forms, hiring-related forms, we can take a look at the I-9, which of course we have completed once we make that hiring decision and we bring someone on board. Now, the I-9 forms used to verify employment eligibility in the U.S. need to be kept for 3 years after an employee's hire date or 1 year after the date that his or her employment ends, whichever is later. So that's your I-9 record retention requirement. And then we have our W-4s, of course, used for payroll purposes. Another important form that comes into play usually at that hiring process. W-4s need to be saved for at least 4 years after the date that taxes were due or paid. Now, this is based on the federal guidelines under the Social Security Act and the IRS. But please note that state laws may vary. So Minnesota, as an example, requires employers to retain W-4s for up to 8 years after the date taxes were due or paid, while Nevada, on the other hand, has no state retention record. Of course, that federal retention requirement still applies. So check your local laws before disposing of any of these forms or materials.
Robin, we had a question come in that I did want to flag and reach out to you right now that came from Kathy. And she asks, in response to the hiring form, how would we know the applicant's age when we don't inquire about age on application?
You're not going to know their age, and good point, Kathy, because we're certainly not going to ask that during the hiring process. But just having that Age Discrimination and Employment Act regulation out there, again, that gives us that 2-year time frame, which is really just, in my estimation, something that gives us a good guideline to set up your retention practices for 2 years. Then you know you're safe. You know, again, we don't have to keep them for 10 years, but at least 2 years under the ADEA, so we can bring that into play and just maintain all our records for everyone.
And piggybacking off of maintaining the records for everyone, we also got a great question from Shirley Robin. Must employees complete a new W-4 each calendar year?
Employees do not have to complete a new W-4 each year. Employees can complete those tax forms if and when they want to make changes. So you may have an employee who's been with your company for 10 years, completed a withholding form, a W-4, 10 years ago when they started. Let's say they claimed single and zero. They've had no need, desire, or interest in changing that, and that is perfectly fine. You have that on record, that was the withholding they chose, and you can just maintain that W-4 until and unless they decide to complete a new one.
Got it.
Good. All right. Let me go on. I'm reading through the questions because
we have a lot of questions coming in, Robin. I don't know if we should address them now or move forward and address them when we move on at the end of the session. Maybe we have time for one more.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on to Jeffrey's question that just asked one because it's going to allow us to move on. Any specific recommendations for setting up files? I think Jeffrey knows why he's on this webinar, because we're going to get to that in a little bit. So let's move on and hopefully have some time for some questions along the way and or as we wrap up. So let's move forward and let's talk a little bit about payroll records. And this may be something that HR is responsible for. If payroll is housed in HR, it may be something that's in a different department. But anyone who's dealing with employee information and employee records is going to really want to be aware of these things as well. So speaking of taxes, as we have been, let's dive into payroll records. If your business uses any vendors or contractors, you will have W-9s on file. And you may or may not get involved with that yourself. It may be something, again, that someone in accounting or in another area handles. But be aware of it that W-9s should be saved for 3 years from the due date of the return. W-9s may have backup withholding that applies. And if that's the case, then those W-9s must be kept for 4 years instead of 3. Another sort of people-related record is proof of business expenses, receipts documenting regular expenses, for example, or travel expenses, travel reimbursements. Those should be held on to as well for 3 years. And then we take a look at, sort of general payroll records. Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act both require employers to save payroll records for 3 years. These are the kinds of records, including, pay stubs, payroll schedules, payroll registers that you run every time you pay folks, proof of overtime wages paid, payroll deductions. All of your payroll records should be retained for 3 years. But again, your state records may vary. So make sure that you check any state laws or state regulations that you may have. And another record and some documentation to kind of keep on file is think about your employee benefit plan records, pension or retirement plan records, or insurance, medical, dental, insurance plan documents. You want to keep those for the full period that the plan is in effect and for at least 1 year after termination. So that comes into play a lot, especially if you change a carrier, for example. You have one medical carrier for your employer-sponsored health plan and you make a switch. I would retain, you want to retain those old plan documents for at least 1 year after that plan has ended. But again, there's no requirement to hang on to those sorts of things for 20 years, which I have seen occur in some organizations or in some HR departments for sure. And then let's take a look at, sort of separate and distinct from payroll, personnel records. What are some of our requirements there? Well, the Fair Labor Standards Act, again, the FLSA, also requires that you store certain personnel records that are related to wages, and you need to retain those for 2 years. So things that fall under that category include wage rates or pay scales that you may have, information on seniority or merit pay systems, performance reviews if they are tied into pay or compensation, or even work schedules. So for example, in the event that you are called upon to explain the basis for paying different wages to different employees, you would want and need to have those records on hand. Now, of course, in general, when we're talking kind of performance records, you're going to save all of those records on your current employees while they're actively employed. When we look at other employment records, the EEOC weighs in on that one for us, and the EEOC requires employers to maintain all employment records for 1 year from the employee's termination date. And again, as I mentioned before, if in the event an employee would bring an EEOC charge on you, you'll need access to those files until a resolution or a decision has been reached. Let's also take a look now at, kind of also in personnel here, our FMLA paperwork. If you are subject to the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, and if an employee takes a leave of absence under the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, then all related information must be saved for at least 3 years. Now that includes things like basic payroll, employee data, the dates or the hours, if it's applicable, that leave is taken. You'll want to maintain the copies of the notices that you furnished to the employee, and all of the records related to certifications from the healthcare provider or other parties. So retain those records for 3 years. Now, again, some states have state family medical leave, so you'll want to refer to any state-specific requirements for your particular jurisdiction, your particular location. And then we have OSHA. the Occupational Safety and Health Administration requires employees to keep records on employees who become injured or ill due to the job for at least 5 years. Although depending upon the circumstances, some of that OSHA paperwork may be required to be maintained for as long as 30 years. There's some very specifics around that. One example of the 30-year requirement is if there's been exposure. But in general, your OSHA records for employees injured or ill on the job maintained for 5 years. And if any disciplinary records or workplace investigations are recorded in an employee's file, for example, then those should be stored ideally for as long as the employee is at your company. Now pay attention to that, however, because there may be some things that are unique to your organization. If you have a collective bargaining agreement or even an HR policy, you may have stipulations at your particular organization that employers remove that information, that disciplinary information, after a certain period of time. So make sure that you're clear on any collective bargaining agreements or any policies that exist that talk to different retention timeframes for disciplinary sorts of records on your employees. And that was a lot. That was a lot to digest. I know we tossed out a lot of numbers, a lot of years, a lot of time frames. And again, don't worry if you didn't catch it all. You'll receive a copy of the slides. There's some related materials that will be available to you. So I know we breezed through a lot of that quite a bit, but you'll get it in your hands to review and have on hand with you. So we've talked now. We've talked now about what we need to keep and how long we need to keep it. But the reality is that sometimes we can get rid of this mountain of old files, old records that we have. Sometimes a lot of our HR departments look like, the Smithsonian or something. We have so many old artifacts in it. So let's talk a little bit about how we can dispose of employee information, because it's certainly not as simple as just tossing the paperwork in the trash or hitting the delete button on the computer. There are numerous ways that we can securely destroy paper files. You can, for example, use locked recycling bins, or you can even hire secure shredding services if you have a high volume of paperwork to destroy, to shred. That's a good option for you. If you prefer to shred the documents yourself, it's advisable to only use cross-cut shredders or micro-cut shredders, because those break up the papers into tinier pieces than a normal strip cut shredder will do for you. And it may sound odd, but even burning old paperwork may be another efficient way to get rid of it, safely of course, but it's certainly an option. The key is that even when you're destroying that information, to remember to keep it secure, even while you're destroying it or after you've destroyed it. Again, you don't want to just toss it away somewhere. Digital files, for those of you that are fully digital, we had about 6% of our attendees that were primarily digital, but we had about 40% of our attendees on the call here today are half and half, still paper and some digital. So those digital files, of course, are harder to get rid of unless you're wiping an entire computer or a hard drive, which you can strip or overwrite or something like that. But if you're deleting just a few files, you may want to explore, and you'll want to explore, using overwriting software to help you in destroying those files. Now, if you're storing your files online in a cloud-based software or with a storage site somewhere, permanently deleting files, it can certainly be much easier. Once they're deleted from that service, they're gone forever. So thinking about going digital and setting up your files and planning for how you're going to destroy them becomes part of that conversation that you would have with a third-party service provider who may be storing your files for you electronically. But again, you'll want to think about how you can destroy those files. I'm going to hop in because I just see a question that came in from Gabriella, who's saying that she still has files with former employees from about 10 years ago. Is it okay to shred those files or put them in storage? And by still having, meaning, you know, just as many of us do, having them in her office, in her files. Yes, Gabriella, it is time to move those files. Now, what you'll want to do is make sure your system is set up correctly in terms of, are there any, again, state-specific laws that you may have that require you to keep things beyond those 10 years. But if not, then as we've covered really with all those federal requirements, all of that material is going to be well past any of the retention needs listed for any of those records. So a 10-year, 10 years past date of termination, those are not records that need to be maintained from any federal record retention standpoint, other than that possibility of an OSHA file for 30 years. But yes, 10 years, you're gonna be absolutely fine to not maintain those paper files anymore. Okay, and Mimi also popped in. Before we move on to organizing, let me just answer this because it's directly related to talking about shredding. You know, I think she's doing what a lot of us do at the beginning of the year, right? I've always done this. 2015, I'm cleaning out, I'm organizing my files, and you end up with a lot of information, multiple garbage bags worth of information. And her question is, can you hire a shredding service to do that? You certainly can, and you should be able to find someone in your area. Where I live, we have lots of shredding services. They have a truck, a secure truck. They'll bring it right to your business site, and you can supervise the shredding of your records with that service. They'll come right to your site and do that. So you certainly have options. So I think we've kind of covered a lot about destroying files, what we need to retain and what we need to destroy. But let's tackle organizing files. It's time to get organized once you've determined what you need to keep and what you can clean out. So it's certainly fine, and as we've determined, and many of us still do, it's certainly fine if you want to or need to stick with some paper records. But we all realize, of course, that the world is moving towards going entirely digital, and in many ways that's a good thing. We can get rid of all this paper on our desk. So how can we do this? Why should we do it, and how can we do it? Well, switching to digital will certainly help clear up the clutter in your office. Once everything is on your computer desktop or saved to your hard drive or in a shared network folder that you have that you can share with other members of your team, you won't have to deal with messy desks and overflowing filing cabinets. And another really great thing about going digital when and where you can, taking that paperwork electronic means that you're leaving a trail. So if an employee, for example, emails you a request for a time off, you'll have a record of it. You'll have an electronic record of it, either in your inbox or in the employee's outbox. It's not a piece of paper that's going to get trapped between piles of folders or accidentally thrown out, and it's much easier to keep track of records too. So in the past, before I actually, at one organization that I worked, and I didn't have a system yet, but I effectively used email and that sort of thing, and moved some forms, kind of built some things online, moved things online, and really organized my records and requests, such as time off requests, electronically. Always had the trail. When somebody asked for something, did they send it? Did they receive it? So certainly much easier to find records than trying to scramble around for a piece of paper. Now, while going digital may take some time up front, switching to electronic records will definitely save you time in the long run. It's certainly easier to type in a search term than to sort through stacks of forms and other reports and other files and other folders. And I found that there are so many programs and software solutions that are out there that don't just handle one thing but allow you to streamline across multiple processes to save you more time. So if you're dealing with, for example, scheduling requests, and you're also dealing with payroll, and you need to find a way to kind of put those two together rather than multiple pieces of paper, there are certainly electronic solutions out there that allow you to do that. There are products that our good friends at HRdirect have. There's TrackSmart, there's Hire Scheduling. There are many ways to eliminate that clutter and simultaneously streamline your processes and make your work a whole lot easier. So if you want to start transitioning to digital, if you want to go digital when you can, where you can start that small. Maybe it's a matter of scanning certain pieces of paperwork for your current employees and then using only digital methods when hiring new employees. Some of our hiring forms that we talked about, I-9s and W-4s, are available electronically and can be completed electronically and can be stored electronically. And that's one easy way to start doing it. The governing agencies for those forms, USCIS, IRS, they have listed out the requirements for gathering, for maintaining electronic signatures, as well as making it a whole lot easier for employers to use things electronically. So you can again find those forms electronically. You can work with vendors and folks that will allow you to digitize not just those forms, but also some other processes. Because of course, online job applications, have been online for a number of years. So things are moving digital more and more, and it's easier than ever, really, to make that transition.
Robin, I wanted to chime in. We got a great question from, looking at the question bank, it was from Kimberly. There we go. And Kimberly asked, is it safe to use cloud-based software, and is it a different requirement, record-keeping requirements, are they different when storing digital files in the cloud?
Yeah, there are certain parameters to follow, certainly. So again, check with the regulatory bodies that are governing forms that you are storing electronically. So as I mentioned, for example, the I-9s, the USCIS requires that your I-9s that are stored electronically have an audit trail. So if you make any alterations or changes to the forms, they can be accessed. And plus, there are some safeguards that are required to prevent any accidental deletions or insertions on I-9 forms. So there are certain requirements for taking these things digital, and that I-9 is really just one example of that. But storing things and then retrieving them or finding them from the cloud is more secure than ever. Provides a great deal of ease, and is certainly something that I really encourage everybody to explore. And of course, when in doubt with any changes or requirements or things that might be different, especially with electronic forms, always check with the agency, the governing agency, or any other organization that may issue updates or record-keeping requirements. But the cloud, I'll give kudos to the federal government when they do it right. It took them a while, but as they've moved those forms online over the last number of years, it has provided a much easier level of access, level of use than the paper forms, most definitely. So I hope that answered the question. Let's move on here to our next section, which we're calling consistency is key, because we're gonna really talk about hitting that target on that slide. Because regardless of whether you use paper or digital, as we've been talking about, consistency is the key to efficient and effective record keeping. And I see Pamela is just popping in with a question, and I think we're going to get to some of her questions around recommendations for how to organize your files. So let's dive into this. When we start with the organization part, we've determined what we need to keep, how long we need to keep it, and what we can destroy. And now we want to figure out a filing system, a retention system that works for our organization. You want to figure out what works for you and stick with it. So finding the best way to classify and organize that paperwork takes time. So, take a few moments to analyze your needs, your particular business needs. What's going to work? What's going to make your life easier? If you're a small or medium-sized single-site business, it might be easiest to manage files by individual employees as opposed to, by departments, by locations. There are some forms, some of the records you're retaining, that in some cases it's easier to manage by retaining those separately, sort of by form type. In fact, it is advisable to store your I-9 forms separately from your personnel files. You'll also want to, for those, you're going to be setting up a tickler file for those, a tickler system, if you will, which allows you to easily re-verify employees who need to have their employment authorization re-verified. And it also allows you to accurately dispose of the old forms for terminated employees. Another good reason to keep your I-9s separate, those forms all separate from other things in your personnel file, is while it is, I'm not saying it's necessarily common, but those are forms that could be subject to an audit by an outside agency. And those are the only forms you want them to see. If that should occur, it's much easier to just have those forms handy all in one place. So that's an example of how you're going to kind of analyze your needs, analyze your workflow, think about what makes sense, but that's certainly one of the types of forms that you may want to file separately and keep as a separate record. And that's kind of with a small company. So another example might be if you have a large organization or multiple locations. You may consider breaking some of your record retention down by department or office location. Again, it depends on what makes sense for you. But once you find that right organizational structure for your record keeping, make sure that you handle all that paperwork in a similar manner. So, for example, if you file your, if your personnel files are maintained by a department for some reason, don't start filing, medical forms and medical files by employee name. Keep everything consistent across your system. So keep that same system across your records. And once you set up your new record keeping system, you'll want to use folders and labels. And I'm talking paper folders and labels, because we saw there's almost half of us on the call are predominantly using paper, but also think of folders and labels in the electronic sense as well. As you're storing things electronically, you're making that transition. But using folders and labels to help keep you organized is, personally has always been a good system for me. And even as your organization makes that transition to more electronic storage or more digital record retention for your HR files, you're going to find that you still have paper. So, as an example, I worked with an organization, and we, over the course of a couple years, transitioned more and more of our HR processes and our HR functions to electronic formats. We went digital, we went electronic with performance appraisals. We moved online for all of our employment applications. We took all of our benefits enrollment and moved all of that online. So we were eliminating a lot of paper, but we didn't eliminate everything. So we still had folders and files for every employee, because we still had some hard documents even as we started to make that transition digital. So we, at that particular organization, were definitely in that split, more and more digital, but still paper. Still paper. And that's one of the realities we deal with. And we want to get our sanity around it. So let's talk about how we can stay sane while we are working with all this documentation, all these records. One of the things to think about is making sure that every piece of paper that you handle should be stored in a labeled folder. I mean, and this may sound like something that makes perfectly common sense, but again, taking the time to sort of think through this and plan your strategy is what can really make you successful. So use labeled folders. I mean, even if it's a random folder, just called forms or something, it helps keep you organized. Folders prevent those papers from being lost and sliding down in the crack of a filing cabinet, and help save valuable time as you're looking for information. I'm in my office right now, and I have a stack of 3 file folders and 1 hanging folder on the corner of my desk, and they all have badly handwritten labels on them, but it helps keep me organized. And folders, and sort of that concept of folders, is equally important if you're storing things digitally. So as you're kind of planning and analyzing your needs and planning your structure, make sure that your folders and how you're going to label them has consistency as well. Meaning, for example, don't put your new health enrollment forms in a folder named 2015 Health Forms when last year's folder was called Health Forms 2014. Keep the sequence of wording, the phrasing, and how you're labeling things consistent. And thinking about archiving, again, those digital folders, if you're archiving email, think about the names, the labels, the folders, how you're storing documents electronically, sort of using that same system. Use that consistently across your HR function, your HR department, because those folders, those all-important folders, and what we're calling them and how we access them become very important when we take a look at security and privacy. And security and privacy issues that come into play in HR every day. And certainly we know that all of our paperwork should be kept secure and private. There are certain forms that contain particularly sensitive information on our employees and need to be treated differently than others. We want to ensure the confidentiality of this information that we're entrusted with, because we're really entrusted with a lot of things. So what should stay private? Well, legally speaking, there are very few federal requirements dictating how private employers should handle employees' personal information, aside from any medical information. And there are 3 relevant laws that cover the privacy and the confidentiality of medical information. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires covered employers to protect the privacy and confidentiality of medical information on any employees who have handicaps, disabilities, or impairments that are covered by the ADA. There is also the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is called GINA, enforced by the EEOC. And Title II of that act prohibits the use of genetic information in employment, and it requires that genetic information, which potentially could be acquired during a family medical leave certification process, as an example, but that genetic information must also be kept confidential and in a separate medical file. And thirdly, for companies offering healthcare benefits, then HIPAA comes into play, which mandates that we ensure the protection of the privacy and confidentiality of our employees' personal health and medical information, PHI, as you may have seen it referred to. As for the other sensitive information that we have, sort of very, very important information, Social Security numbers, home addresses, bank account information that we may have for payroll purposes. There are some states that have laws protecting your employees' privacy on those things. So as always, make sure you're following state guidelines. But even, of course, if your state isn't covered, it's critical to protect employees' privacy and try your hardest to restrict access to information. So it's a matter of segregating and maintaining the confidentiality of the information, but also setting these things up in an easily retrievable way that you can access when you need. So personally, when dealing with paper files, paper records, paper employee information, I have frequently set up a system that worked very well and set it up in such a manner. I usually set up employee records, personnel files, if you will, by employee name. And for each employee, I have found it works really well to have a personnel file for each employee, a confidential medical file for each employee, and then a third file as needed for each individual leave of absence situation for each employee. So what I found worked well for me quite often was, again, organizing by employee name, 3 separate and distinct files set up, and primarily so that those the key was really segregating that medical information and that leave of absence information from the personnel file. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, I've always stored I-9 separately with a tickler system. Gives me ease of retrieval, ease of auditing, ease of destroying those. And employee investigation materials. If I had an investigation, workplace harassment, a disciplinary issue, where I had witness statements and those sorts of things, I would retain those investigation files, again, separate, cross-referenced by name, date of incident, that sort of thing. But again, separate and distinct from personnel files. And then, of course, applicant records and resumes with those requirements to store for either 1 or 2 years, but applicants and applications and resumes and those related materials stored in yet a separate area. And again, talking paper here, stored in a separate area. And what I found worked best for me many times was setting those up by year and then having a folder within that for each specific requisition or job opening, and then within that the applications, resumes, and all the related documents for that hiring process. So there are many ways that you can do it. I just wanted to share a couple of things that worked very well for me and have consistently worked well for me. But again, a lot of it becomes, as we said, really evaluating what works best for your organization. As we dive into this a little bit more, we see how to keep information secure is also top of mind, because we really need to think about it. So a couple of tips around that. For starters, include a written policy in your handbook that covers how your business protects your employees' information. If you share access to employee files, keep a log of who viewed the information, when it was seen, and the reason for sharing it. And this works well, in any size of organization. I worked for many years ago. I worked for an organization. We had about 5,000 employees. We had a huge, as you can imagine, secure, locked file room for all of these 5,000 employee files. And anytime I went in to access an employee file, I had to sign in the log that file out, sign it back in when I came back in. So having that sort of system really kind of helps you keep your information, your access secure. One of the best ways that you can keep that information secure, keep those files secure, is use confidential folders and really call them that. You're taking these folders and you're storing them in locked rooms. Just as in that example I mentioned, you're going to know who comes into contact with the file and when, since you control the access to the keys and to the actual room.
Robin, I noticed I had a question that came in that I wanted to call out right now, which I think would be appropriate. It came in from Mark, and he asked about using folders to keep information secure. He asked, can you use regular folders, or should you use folders that are specifically designed for the confidentiality rules? That's a good question. You certainly can, of course, use a regular folder or pocket folders to make sure that your forms are secure and stay in place. And you can label that yourself, certainly. But you may often be better off if you use a folder specifically designed to really keep that information not only secure but confidential. And here's why I say that, because if I'm having a meeting with an employee, if an employee comes and wants to view their folder, it's about much more than the mechanism for me to maintain those records. It's also about that employee's perception of how I'm maintaining their information.
So if I come to meet with an employee and who wants to look at their employee record, and they see that I'm presenting their information to them in a secure folder that's marked confidential, looks professional, they see that it's tough to get access to, that sort of confers a level of trust and a level of professionalism to how records are maintained. So ease of use for HR certainly, but also something that gives really a good reflection to employees or managers or executives who may see how we're storing documents. So it can definitely help to use something specifically confidential. Digital files. Let's talk about digital files. Digital files, if you're storing that information, should most definitely be encrypted. If possible, of course, store them on a secure computer, secure servers, things that require authentication to access. Putting a password protection on a file is, quite frankly, not enough. You want to have user logins as well, because that's going to provide you a digital access log. So any digital information, you're going to want to, again, kind of keep that trail. Think of it as your digital file room. You want to keep that log of who accessed that information. If you're storing electronic information in different locations, like flash drives or something, of course you need to use the same precautions, because those are portable. Those are easily pocketable. And you don't want to be compromising your employees' security and the security of their information. So if you're storing information in the cloud, be cautious. Make sure that the service you're using is secure and reputable. And as you start to sort of explore those opportunities, to move things digital, to perhaps store things in the cloud, any service provider that you use to help you do that, talking through security and safeguards is, of course, going to be top of mind. So let's take a look at some personal tips for how do we deal with this. The final tip that we've got here today in record keeping is one of the easiest ones to follow, and it's don't put off for tomorrow what you can do today. And this applies, across our lives. I'm sure many of us set New Year's resolutions to do the exact same thing in other aspects of our lives, but it really applies to sort of keeping control of your records in the HR function. So let's imagine a scenario to kind of illustrate what I mean by that. Imagine that an employee hands you a vacation request form. You take that form, and if you input it immediately, it should take about 5 minutes or less, depending upon how your business handles that sort of thing. 5 minutes to enter it, and it's over. It's done, and you're on to the next thing. But now imagine that another employee comes by and hands you another vacation request form, but this time you put it on your desk to do later, once you finish, something else that you're working on, because that's life. But you shift gears, you focus on the task at hand, and you forget about that vacation request form. It gets buried under some other papers, and then later the employee follows up, and then you have to remember where you put the form, shuffle through other papers, dig through your desk, see if you can even find it, and that, of course, takes a lot longer than 5 minutes. Been there, done that, I think we all have. Now, obviously, you can't break every time an employee submits a vacation request form, but start to kind of shift your mind and think of ways. This becomes part of that organizing of how can you take care of papers as they come in some way, whether it's setting up a specific inbox for requests or scheduling 30 minutes at the end of every day. Make these things that you do every single day, and you'll gain 5 minutes here or 5 minutes there. It's a technique. It's something that that has worked very effectively in a number of HR departments I've worked in. One of my recent experiences was we had a locked and secured file room, and all of our employee files were in there, and they were set up. We kept that file room door open when we were in the office because it was right there. No one else was able to walk in. We had a filing inbox in that file room. So every day, as would happen, people would come and drop things off, pieces of paper that needed to go into their employee files, whatever they may be. So we may get no pieces of paper. We might have gotten 5. We might have gotten 40. It depended. And if these were things that didn't necessarily need to be acted on or were acted on but then needed to be filed, what we did, whoever got that piece of paper, put it in that inbox. And then every day, at the end of the day, a member of the HR team would take 5 minutes, go into the file room, see what was in that inbox, and file it away. And so we tackled it every day. And it took 5 to 10 to 15 minutes, perhaps at the max. But we found that if we let it sit there for a week or 2, that then it became an insurmountable task. So don't save things for later if you can. It, of course, depends on your personal work style. It may be an adjustment at first, but it can really lead to some efficiency. So a few wrap-up things, some final notes, some summary of some things that we covered today. Let's really review the key points. Before you begin to organize, lay your strategy for organization. Before you begin to organize your records, you should clean them out. But again, don't just throw everything out. Make sure that you're following federal and state guidelines on how long everything should be kept. And on the flip side, take a look at those records you have that maybe you don't have to have anymore. So really do that assessment. That's the first step. And when you do discard that information, you get rid of those records that you no longer need to retain, do it securely using a shredding service or overwriting software, whatever applies. Once those files are cleaned out, then another great way to streamline your records is to switch or begin that transition to electronic or digital records. Start scanning old paperwork, as we talked about, and maybe consider having your new employees fill out their forms online. Whether you start making that switch to digital or you stick with our tried and true paper retention, be consistent in all storage that you do. Take that time to establish the system and the organizational process that works best for your business, best for your day-to-day work style, day-to-day work requirements. But take the time really to sit down and kind of strategize on that. And when it comes to that consistency and security, folders, like I said, can be your friends, really. Think folders. Think whether that be electronic folders or whether that be, again, our paper folders, labeled folders, things that help you keep track. What is the system that you're going to set up? Grouping information together. How are you going to do that? How are you going to keep your sensitive information private? Folders alone aren't going to keep information secure. However, you do that, you keep them in locked rooms, you have access logs. Those goes a long way to keeping information secure. And of course, electronic records should be encrypted and have user authentication so you can monitor and limit the access to those too. And finally, again, sort of that personal switch, but do what you can as soon as you can. I really think that helps. Set aside time at the end of every day or even the end of every week, but set that time aside to take care of those records and that paperwork. Don't let it pile up. Take a few minutes and you'll save yourself loads of time later on. So thank you, everyone. I know we covered a lot of information. And I'm not sure, Stephanie, if we have time for any questions or not.
Robin, we are over time, so we are out of time for questions, but we do thank everyone for their participation today, asking questions, being involved. We really had some great items to review, Robin. I learned a lot, I know, learning about record-keeping requirements, and I think everyone now is motivated to start fresh in 2015 and make sure their record-keeping is compliant and up-to-date. So thank you again, Robin. We really appreciate it. And I do want to let everyone know within the next 2 days, you will receive an email with the recording and slides from today's webinar. You will receive that. And I also want to let you know you'll receive information about some of the products. People were asking questions about products. We'll be able to send those to you as well in the email. And also in 2015, there's been a lot of topic questions about disengaged employees in 2014. We'll be touching base on that next month, so stay tuned in your email for a registration link for that for our next free webinar. It'll be presented February 11th, 2015 at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we will have Lisa Perez, who is the co-founder of HBL Resources, and she will be providing that event. So thank you, and another reminder, you'll receive a short survey when the presentation is finished, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone.